The mud-caked MMA gloves hit the grass with a heavy thud, sliding to a stop right at the toes of my worn canvas sneakers. "Put them on, you freeloading hag," Brandon roared, shoving his square jaw toward the dozens of suddenly silent guests, and in that moment, I knew he'd sealed his own fate. He slammed his fists together, veins bulging in his neck. "Or just stand there and cower. Let me break your bones right here, so your little brat can open her eyes and see what a piece of useless trash her mother really is on this estate." 3 steps away, my 16-year-old daughter, Lena, shrank back, her face pale with terror. In the distance, my stepmother, Celeste, took a slow sip of red wine, her lips curling into an approving smirk. She was celebrating my humiliation on the very land my blood and sweat had helped keep. I didn't cry. I didn't step back. The bitter autumn wind cut through my baggy cardigan, grazing the thick scars hidden beneath the fabric. I just slowly relaxed my arms at my sides. This delusional punk had no idea he had just called a former Tier 1 operative trash, and he had just stripped away his own last chance of survival. I locked my dead eyes on his throat and calculated exactly 9 seconds. Before I show you how those 9 seconds ended, pause for a moment. Take the time to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I want to know how many people are staying awake with me to face the wounds inflicted by family. And now let's rewind the clock to exactly 3 months ago, so you can understand why. I was standing on the lawn of my own home, looking so ragged. 3 months ago. For massive moving trucks choked the gravel driveway, engines rumbling and spitting exhaust into the damp morning air. I stood perfectly still at the threshold of the living room, my knuckles white as I gripped a stack of yellowed bank statements. Shriek, the deafening tear of packing tape echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. Then came the sharp screech of a hammer claw prying iron nails from drywall. 2 careless movers were ripping my late mother's oil portrait down from the brick mantel, oblivious to the scratched paint. They just needed it gone. Celeste stood dead center in the foyer, a plush gray fur coat draped over her shoulders. She pointed a red manicured finger toward the porch. "Toss the rest of that old junk in the dumpster," she snapped. My clothes, a few faded cotton t-shirts, a pair of worn Duluth work pants, and scuffed canvas sneakers, were already kicked into a pathetic heap by the front door. Behind Celeste, a brand new oversized leather sofa sat under the crystal chandelier. The heavy stench of cured leather and fresh wall paint suffocated the familiar scent of old oak that used to define this house. I remained completely silent. The thick scar tissue on my right wrist throbbed against my frayed cardigan sleeve. I kept my back perfectly straight, my breathing slow and measured. I looked down at the rough, faded paper in my hand. 10 years ago, the bank almost foreclosed on this entire estate. The blurred numbers on these receipts represented 3 brutal years of my life. 3 years of chewing dry canned food, sleeping on freezing dirt floors, sending every dime of my meager payback to cover my father's debts. Not a single brick here was spared from my sweat. Celeste brushed past me. Her perfume hit my nose, thick, chemical, and cheap. The sharp clatter of her stilettos on the hardwood floor was meant to intimidate. "The main house needs a total renovation," she threw the words over her shoulder without bothering to look at my face. "Move your stuff out to that wooden shed by the fence. Victor told me you prefer living in tight spaces anyway. It suits you." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Arguments were for people who still had hope. I simply crouched down and shoved my faded shirts into a damp cardboard box. My movements were exact, efficient, no wasted energy. Before leaving, I walked into the kitchen to grab my last stack of mail. Celeste had dumped a pile of glossy lifestyle magazines haphazardly across the granite island. As I pushed them aside to clean the surface, my hand froze. A crumpled sheet of fax paper stuck out from the bottom of the pile. I pulled it loose. The faint black ink of a government procurement logo sat at the top left corner. It was a business license application, Sterling Freight, registered to this exact property address. And right under the applicant name, she had boldly printed, "Celeste Stone, wife of General Victor Stone." She wasn't just claiming the living room and the leather sofa. She was preparing to siphon federal contract funds using my family's name. My pupils dilated. A fatal flaw in her perfect, arrogant armor had just exposed itself right here on the kitchen counter. I didn't scream about fairness. I didn't march into the foyer to demand my bedroom back. I simply folded the fax paper in half, then into quarters. I pressed my thumb hard along the crease, flattening the edge with absolute mechanical precision. I slid it deep into the front pocket of my jeans. I picked up my cardboard box. I walked past the sweating movers, stepping out the front door into the chill. Click, the heavy brass deadbolt locked into place behind me. The dry hollow sound echoed across the porch. Locked out of my own home. A sharp autumn wind whipped across the wet lawn. It cut right through my thin sweater. It carried the strong scent of wild lilacs blooming near the rotting wooden shed at the back of the property. That smell hit my sinuses like a physical blow. It dragged me violently backward, 15 years ago. The exact afternoon I realized nobody in this family was ever coming to save me. I dropped the damp cardboard box onto the dusty floor of the shed. The impact sent a cloud of gray grit into the stale, freezing air. The sharp scent of wild lilacs drifted through the cracked window. It pulled me violently backward. I was 17. Standing on the polished hardwood of the main house library, gripping a thick cream-colored envelope. My acceptance letter to the academy. Top of the class. My fingers were sweating, pressing creases into the heavy paper. My father, Victor, shoved past me. He stuffed a thick stack of manila folders into his leather briefcase. He didn't look at the envelope. He didn't even look at my face. "I'm late for my flight," he muttered, snapping the brass buckle shut. "Tell the housekeeper to lock up." The heavy thud of his boots echoed against the wood floor, growing fainter, then disappearing entirely. In his world, I was just a low-priority memo. A piece of paper shoved to the bottom of his desk. I walked out to the backyard, crushing dead leaves under my shoes. My mother, Helen, was waiting near the lilac bushes. She didn't offer a hug. No soft, comforting words. She simply tossed a pair of cracked leather gloves at my chest. We'd stood on the hard-packed dirt. She didn't teach me how to bake or act like a lady. She taught me how to drop my heart rate to a crawl when backed into a corner. How to isolate a joint and apply leverage until the bone threatened to snap. I remember the sharp metallic taste of rust spreading across my tongue. Warm blood welling up from a split lip after she caught me with a brutal, unexpected elbow to the mouth. "If nobody sees you, you protect yourself," she said, her voice completely flat, watching me spit red into the dirt. Tears don't stop fists. A deafening roar shattered the memory. A modified exhaust pipe screamed outside. Brandon, Celeste's 19-year-old kid, killed the engine of his brand-new BMW, the tires kicking up wet gravel. He stepped out shirtless, dragging a massive suede heavy bag across the grass. The thing had to weigh 200 pounds. He didn't hang it on the wide, empty porch of the main house. He dragged it straight toward the old oak tree. Less than 5 steps from my shed window. The thick steel chains clanked loudly, metal grinding against metal as he hooked it over a thick branch. It wasn't about a workout. It was a threat. An arrogant punk marking his territory, stepping directly onto the last few square feet of breathing room I had left. He wrapped his hands with cheap athletic tape. He planted his boots in the mud and started throwing heavy, swinging hooks into the suede. Asterisk thud. Thud, asterisk the dull, heavy impacts echoed across the yard. The thin, rotting wooden walls of my shed vibrated. The cheap glass panes rattled loosely in their frames, threatening to shatter with every punch. I turned away from the window. Lena sat on the edge of a rusty twin cot in the corner of the room. My 16-year-old daughter had her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her hands were clamped hard over her ears, her narrow shoulders shaking with every strike against the bag outside. If you're listening to this and you understand what it feels like to be completely invisible to the people who are supposed to protect you, do me a favor. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below with a simple yes. Just one word. So I know I'm not the only one who had to learn how to survive their own family. I looked at my daughter trembling in the cold, damp shadows of a shed we were forced into. Then I looked back through the narrow gap in the curtains. Brandon threw another wild right hook, grinning right at the glass. I reached for the top button of my baggy cardigan. I slipped it off my shoulders and tossed it over the back of a broken wooden chair. If I stayed invisible today, those fists would find their way through my front door tomorrow. The morning air hung heavy with damp humidity. I ignored Brandon's arrogant glare from the oak tree. I dragged 4 heavy sheets of raw plywood and a box of thick iron nails from the back of the shed. I picked up a framing hammer. The rubber grip was worn, familiar. Outside, Brandon was punishing the heavy suede bag. Asterisk thud. 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 Asterisk his rhythm was erratic, fueled by cheap energy drinks and ego. I measured the distance across the rotting porch posts, covering Lena's window. I lined up the first nail. I swung the hammer. Bang, solid steel driving deep into old wood. Sweat stung the center of my spine, soaking through the frayed fabric of my gray cardigan. I grabbed another nail. Bang, I was building a physical barrier. A blind made of scrap wood and desperate necessity, blocking the line of sight from the oak tree directly into my 16-year-old daughter's room. My swings were exact, relentless. A machine-like pace that never sped up and never slowed down. Outside, Brandon's punches started to drag. He was getting gassed. The steady, unfazed rhythm of my hammer was getting under his skin, breaking his concentration. Night brought a biting, miserable chill. Cold wind whistled through the gaps in the warped floorboards. I sat stiffly on a rigid wooden chair, pulling a thin fleece blanket tight over my shoulders. I opened my laptop. A private network booted up, casting a harsh green glow across the dark, dusty walls of the shed. By day, I was just a broke single mother hammering nails to survive. Tonight, my callous fingers moved across the trackpad with quiet precision. I swept through thousands of pages of federal procurement records. I isolated the application for sterling freight. I packaged the raw financial data into a secure, encrypted folder. Waiting. A faint knock interrupted the wind. The door creaked open. Margaret, the old housekeeper, slipped inside. She didn't say a single word. She set a steaming bowl of beef stew next to my keyboard. I watched the steam curl into the cold air. The rich, heavy smell of roasted carrots and thick gravy filled the freezing room. It was the only warmth left on this estate. Before turning away, her wrinkled hand patted my shoulder. She pressed a crumpled slip of paper into my palm. I unfolded it under the screen's glow. A credit card statement. Celeste had just charged $10,000 in designer goods directly to the estate's joint account. The next afternoon, the sun burned hot against the gravel driveway. Lena backed my rusty sedan out of the dirt patch to wash it. She turned on the cheap dashboard radio. A faint, twangy country song drifted through the open windows, breaking the suffocating silence of the yard. She scrubbed the hood, keeping her head down. The heavy oak front door of the main house swung open. Brandon stepped out onto the porch. He scowled at the car. He marched straight across the lawn, walking with the exaggerated swagger of a guy who spent too much time staring at the mirrors in a strip mall gym. He didn't ask her to turn it down. He didn't speak at all. He just reached his thick arm through the open driver's side window, grabbed the cheap plastic volume knob, and violently wrenched it sideways. Crack, the plastic snapped off in his thick fingers. The music died instantly, leaving only the harsh hiss of static. Lena froze. She clutched a soapy rag tight to her chest, pressing her back against the wet car door. Her breathing turned shallow. I was standing near the woodpile. I felt the rough fiberglass handle of the splitting maul slide through my palms. I didn't let the heavy steel head drop. I controlled the descent, setting it gently onto the dirt. The wall of patience I had spent 3 months building finally fractured. I wiped the sawdust off my worn jeans. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I just started walking directly toward the car. Late October brought a biting frost to the land, and with it, a cheap plastic trophy. Brandon had won a local amateur MMA tournament. Celeste, ever the social climber, decided this was cause for a massive, catered celebration at the main house. Luxury SUVs choked the driveway, their chrome gleaming under the autumn sun. The heavy thump of bass from a live jazz band vibrated against the old drywall, trying to mask the tension that still lingered in the air. By late afternoon, the back door of the main house banged open. Brandon stumbled out onto the lawn, dragging 2 of his gym buddies, Chase and Dylan, with him. They reeked of stale beer, sweat, and cheap vape smoke. They didn't head for the heavy bag under the oak tree. Instead, they walked straight toward the back property line, toward the lilac garden. My mother Helen's garden. The only patch of dirt Victor had ever promised to leave untouched. The only quiet space I had left when the nightmares crept in, now being invaded. Brandon started showing off for his friends. He threw sloppy, drunken roundhouse kicks, the heavy heel of his leather boot slamming into the bushes. Snap, thick old branches broke. Tiny, dormant buds were crushed into the freezing mud. The sharp, bitter scent of torn sap bled into the air, mixing with the sickening smell of alcohol. Lena was sitting on the rotting wooden steps of our shed, a worn paperback resting in her lap. Every time a branch cracked, her narrow shoulders flinched. Chase noticed her first. He elbowed Dylan. A low, crude whistle cut through the cold air. They laughed. Their eyes raked over my 16-year-old daughter with a disgusting, predatory entitlement that made my skin crawl. Brandon didn't tell them to back off. He spit a thick wad of saliva right onto the roots of a broken lilac bush. He jerked his chin toward the shed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Don't worry about it, boys," Brandon slurred, grinning at his friends. "The old hag in there is a coward. She just hides in the corner and leeches off my stepdad. Nothing but trash." Lena's face drained of all color. Tears spilled over her lower lashes. She clutched her book tight to her chest and scrambled backward into the dark shed, slamming the flimsy door shut. Inside, my calloused fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. I stared at the glowing green lines on the screen for one full second. Then I pushed the lid down. A sharp plastic click echoed in the silence. I stood up. I pushed the wooden chair back. My heart rate dropped automatically. The anger didn't boil. It froze solid. The pounding in my ears faded into complete silence. My breathing shifted into a slow, measured count. Asterisk inhale. Exhale. Asterisk muscle memory was waking up in the dark. I opened the door and stepped out into the freezing wind. I didn't storm across the grass. I walked with an even, heavy stride, no wasted movement. I stopped exactly at the border of the garden. The crushed lilac branches lay at the toe of my canvas sneakers. I locked my eyes straight into Brandon's dilated pupils. My face was completely blank. "Get off my mother's property," I said. The volume was low. The tone was flat, striking like a hammer against a steel anvil. "Now." Brandon stopped laughing. His chest heaved. He stomped his heavy boot down, purposefully crushing another cluster of fallen flowers deep into the mud. "This garbage patch is on my stepdad's land," he sneered, puffing out his chest to look big in front of his buddies. He marched heavily toward me. The stench of stale beer rolled off his breath, thick and sour. "I step wherever I want. You giving me orders?" He was 19, drunk, and fueled by pure arrogance. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Who do you think you are, you useless parasite?" Before I could even blink, his massive hand shot out. His thick fingers clamped hard around the collar of my gray cardigan, twisting the fabric tight against my collarbone. He leaned his weight back, planting his boots in the mud, intending to use his sheer muscle to lift me straight off the ground. My brain didn't register fear. It registered physics. 15 years of muscle memory woke up on the freezing grass. I swallowed the bitter irony of having to use my dead mother's brutal survival lessons on her own sacred ground. I didn't throw a punch. I didn't shout. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a struggle. I simply shifted my hips 15 degrees to the left. The precise change in my center of gravity completely killed his upward momentum. He was pulling dead weight. Before his alcohol-soaked brain could process the resistance, my left hand snapped up. I hooked my fingers over his thick, sweaty wrist. I yanked his hand tight against my chest, locking his arm in place. Brandon blinked. His jaw slacked. He was lagging a fraction of a second behind reality. He never got the chance to catch up. My right thumb dug hard into the soft groove of muscle under his forearm. I didn't grab. I stabbed. I found the exact location of the median nerve. I drove my entire body weight down into that single, vulnerable square inch of flesh. At the exact same moment, I shoved my right elbow violently upward, snapping his elbow joint backward against its natural hinge. It wasn't a fight. It was a brutal application of leverage. The structural integrity of a 200-pound man broke in a tenth of a second. His heavy knees slammed into the grass. Thud. His torso pitched forward, his face bearing straight into the freezing, wet mud of the lilac garden. A high-pitched, choked squeal forced its way out of his throat. His massive body twitched on the cold ground, paralyzed by the sudden electrical shock of raw nerve pain. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move a single muscle. I held his face in the dirt for less than one full second. Then I let go. I took 2 quick steps backward. I raised both my hands up to my chest. My face instantly transformed into a mask of perfectly faked, mild shock. "Geez, watch out for the tree roots, kid," I said. My voice was completely steady. From their blind angle, Dylan and Chase hadn't seen the joint lock. They hadn't seen the nerve strike. All they saw was Brandon, a rushed middle-aged woman, grab her sweater and inexplicably faceplant into the mud like a clumsy drunk. Chase let out a confused snort of laughter. Brandon scrambled to his knees, spitting dark mud from his lips. He clutched his throbbing wrist tight to his chest. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, overflowing with pure shock and stinging humiliation. He opened his mouth to scream, to salvage his bruised ego, but his throat was locked tight. He couldn't form a single word in front of his friends. The illusion of his power was shattered. If you know exactly how satisfying it feels to finally stand up and crush the ego of a bully in your own family, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop the word survive in the comments below, so I know you're standing with me against this kind of abuse. I didn't wait for him to find his voice. I turned my back on him, leaving him kneeling in the dirt. I walked up the rotting wooden steps of the shed. I pushed Lena gently inside and shut the heavy door behind us. Click. I slid the cheap metal deadbolt into place. I pulled the faded, dusty curtains shut across the rattling glass panes. The yard outside went dead silent. But I wasn't fooled. I wiped a speck of wet earth from my knuckles. I knew exactly what that silence meant. That fall was just the primer. Celeste was coming tonight. 10 o'clock at night. The flimsy wooden door of the shed kicked open with a violent crash. Rusty iron hinges shrieked, tearing half out of the dry-rotted wood. Celeste stormed in. The heavy, suffocating stench of her $300 perfume instantly swallowed the familiar smell of damp sawdust. Her makeup was flawless, but the muscles in her neck were rigid with fury. Brandon slinked in right behind her. The 200-pound gym rat kept his eyes glued to the floorboards, cradling his swollen wrist against his chest. A perfect, pathetic picture of a victim. I didn't flinch. I was standing by the sink, wiping down the cheap laminate counter with a damp rag. I folded the rag exactly in half, then into quarters. I set it down on the edge of the sink, perfectly aligned with the grain of the wood. I turned around and crossed my arms over my chest. I kept my breathing completely flat. "You put your hands on my son, you psycho," Celeste screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "He said you tripped him. You used some dirty, cheap trick to drop him in the mud." I didn't defend myself. Pleading with a master manipulator is a waste of oxygen. "Your son grabbed my shirt," I said. My voice was a dead, flat line. I stepped backward. He lost his balance in the dirt. Celeste's face contorted. She lunged forward, closing the distance. She jabbed a sharp, red, manicured fingernail hard against my collarbone. "Brandon is a trained fighter. He doesn't trip," she hissed, spraying a fine mist of saliva into the cold air. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic freeloader. If you ever look at my son the wrong way again, I am calling General Khan. I will tell Arthur to throw you and your brat out onto the street tonight. I'll make sure he cuts you out of everything." She pulled her hand back, her lip curling into a sneer of absolute disgust. "And I will let Brandon smash your arrogant face into the pavement." I stared right through her. The worst part wasn't the threat. It was the crushing, heavy realization that she was right. My father would believe her. He would take the word of his shiny new wife over the daughter who had paid his debts with blood money. Any lingering, pathetic hope I'd held onto about this family died right there on the dusty floorboards. Celeste spun around on her stilettos. She stormed out, dragging her son behind her. Brandon shot me one last toxic glare over his shoulder before pulling the broken door shut. Bang! The thin walls of the shed vibrated. Dust drifted down from the exposed rafters. I stood completely still in the dark. The cold air rushed in through the crack in the doorframe. I uncrossed my arms. I reached for a glass of tap water resting on the kitchen table. I tipped my head back and drank the whole thing in one long, unbroken swallow. The water hit my stomach like a block of ice. 3 months of biting my tongue out of respect for my father. 3 months of sleeping in a shed. 3 months of building walls just to protect my kid. It was over. If they wanted to use money and power to crush me, they were going to learn a very hard lesson about how the real world worked. I pulled out the rigid wooden chair. I sat down. I opened the lid of my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a cold green glow over my knuckles. I didn't open a browser. I bypassed the standard gateway and connected directly into the secure federal procurement server. If Celeste wanted a war over real estate and influence, I was going to show her exactly what real power looked like. In the pitch black of the shed, the cold light of the screen illuminated the sharp angles of my cheekbones. I scrolled through the $40 million government procurement file. Celeste had brazenly forged the warehouse capacity numbers for Sterling Freight. Worse, she had listed Arthur as the lead advisor to bypass background checks, trading on his name without his knowledge. I didn't reject the file outright. That would be too quick, too clean. I typed a single command line, freezing the application entirely. I flagged the digital folder under pending direct review, critical conflict of interest. The trap was set. It was invisible, quiet, and absolutely lethal to her bank account. I pushed the laptop screen down. Click. The dry sound of cheap plastic snapping shut. The judgment was signed. 3 days later, the gravel driveway was choked with luxury SUVs. It was Saturday afternoon. Celeste was hosting a massive catered party to celebrate the completion of her new glass greenhouse. The heavy, thumping rhythm of a live jazz band drifted across the lawn, mixing with the sharp clinking of crystal wine glasses. The smell of charred barbecue and expensive cologne hung thick in the cold air. I stood in the shadows near the edge of the patio, wearing my gray, frayed cardigan. My worn canvas sneakers crunched softly against the loose gravel. I kept one arm firmly wrapped around Lena's shoulders, pulling her close. I played the part of the invisible ghost perfectly, watching Celeste glide through the crowd in a tailored suit. She was loudly boasting to a group of investors about the massive government contract she was about to secure. She had no idea the woman standing in the torn sweater 20 feet away had already severed the oxygen line to her entire future. Suddenly, the crowd near the bar parted. The jazz music seemed to fade into the background. Brandon pushed his way through the well-dressed guests, completely ignoring the country club dress code. He was wearing a tight, sweat-soaked rash guard, hauling a filthy gym bag over his shoulder. His jaw was locked tight. The humiliation from 3 days ago was still burning in his red, bloodshot eyes. He marched straight across the lawn, heading directly for the shadows where I stood. He didn't say a word to the guests. He reached into his bag, pulled out a pair of mud-caked MMA gloves, and hurled them onto the grass. They hit the ground with a heavy thud, sliding to a stop inches from my canvas shoes. "Put them on, you freeloading hag," he roared. The entire party went dead silent. The jazz band stopped playing. Brandon shoved his square jaw forward, veins bulging in his neck. He stepped closer, deliberately forcing Lena to shrink back against the rough stone wall of the patio. Or just stand there and cower. "Let me break your bones right here so your little brat can see what a piece of useless trash her mother really is on this estate." Across the lawn, Celeste didn't intervene. She took a slow sip of her Cabernet, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. I didn't step back. The bitter autumn wind cut right through my clothes, brushing against the thick scars hidden beneath my wool sweater. This arrogant punk didn't realize he had just crossed the final physical line. I reached up and unbuttoned the frayed cardigan. I pulled it off my shoulders and folded it perfectly in half. I draped it over the back of a wrought iron patio chair, leaving me in just a plain black t-shirt. I stepped out of the shadows, walking onto the open grass. I let my arms hang loose and relaxed at my sides. I locked my eyes directly onto his throat. "When you want to quit," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying through the dead silence of the yard. "Just stay down." 9 seconds on the clock. Brandon roared, rushing forward like a bull. He opened with a heavy 1-2 combination aimed directly at my jaw. To the crowd, the punches looked fast. To me, they were sluggish, broadcasted seconds in advance. There was a massive delay in his reaction time. I didn't raise my hands to block. I simply stepped a half-pace to the left, sliding smoothly into the blind spot inside his guard. Using the exact momentum of his own forward lunge, I placed my open palm against his triceps. I shoved hard, forcing his center of gravity to spill forward over his knees. He stumbled violently, his heavy boots tearing a massive chunk of sod out of the manicured lawn. His face flushed dark red with embarrassment. Humiliated by the miss, he overcorrected. He planted his lead foot and threw his gym bro specialty, a flashy spinning back kick meant to take my head off. He made the ultimate amateur mistake. He took his eyes off the target. I closed the distance before his kicking leg even left the ground. The toe of my canvas sneaker hooked sharply behind his standing ankle. At the same time, I drove the heel of my palm hard into his shoulder blade. He went airborne. His back hit the ground with a loud, hollow thud. All the air was violently forced out of his lungs. The humiliation completely consumed his logic. He scrambled to his hands and knees, abandoning his amateur MMA techniques entirely. He lunged for my legs, trying to tackle me. He wanted to use his 200 pounds of sheer mass to crush me into the dirt. I waited for exactly that moment. I dropped my center of gravity, throwing my hips hard backward into a sprawl. The upward kinetic energy of his tackle smashed directly into the dead weight of my body driving downward. He stopped dead in his tracks. My body weight pinned him flat against the wet, muddy grass. I hooked my left forearm loosely over the back of his neck. I threaded my right arm under his armpit, applying a slow, excruciating pressure to his cervical spine. His face was buried deep in the cold mud. "Breathe," I whispered coldly near his ear. "You're running out of oxygen." His massive arms clawed uselessly at my calves. His face turned from red to a deep, mottled purple. Suffocation and complete disgrace broke him in seconds. His muddy, trembling hand slapped the wet grass. Slap. Slap. Slap star. He tapped out. In front of 50 of Celeste's high society friends. If you know exactly how satisfying it feels to finally stand up and crush the ego of a bully in your own family, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop the word "finally" in the comments below, so I know you've experienced that exact same moment of justice. I stood up immediately, brushing a streak of mud off my black t-shirt. I didn't look down at him. I looked toward the patio, meeting Lena's terrified eyes. That was the only regret. Having to expose this violent, survivalist part of myself to my 16-year-old daughter. The silence on the lawn shattered. Celeste let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped her crystal wine glass, the shards exploding across the stone patio. She sprinted across the grass in her stilettos, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She didn't check on her gasping son. She lunged straight at me, her manicured fingers clawing wildly at the air. "You animal," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she fumbled for her cell phone. "I'm calling the police. I'm having you thrown in a cell tonight, you psychotic trash." The silence following Celeste's scream was suffocating. The guests stared wide-eyed, completely paralyzed. Celeste stood trembling on the patio. She pulled her cell phone out of her expensive blazer. Her fingers shook violently as she punched 3 numbers. Right in front of her high society crowd, she launched into a breathless, hysterical performance, claiming a psychotic woman had just violently attacked her teenage son unprovoked. I stepped back from the mud. I wiped a clump of wet grass off the knee of my worn jeans. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, clasping my hands loosely behind my back, my spine perfectly straight. I lowered my chin, my breathing slow, waiting. 15 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol cruiser reflected off the rough stone wall of the patio. Captain David Sterling walked heavily across the lawn. The heavy leather of his utility belt creaked with every step. He rested one hand casually over his radio. Celeste rushed him instantly. She grabbed his uniform sleeve, her acrylic nails digging into the fabric. "Captain, I am Celeste Vance Kahn. My husband is General Arthur Kahn," she demanded, her voice shrill and full of manufactured panic. "Arrest that lunatic right now. Handcuff her. She tried to kill my son." Captain Sterling didn't flinch. He firmly pulled his arm away from her grip. He looked down at Brandon, who was still kneeling in the dirt, clutching his throat and refusing to make eye contact. Then the captain looked at me, standing perfectly still in my faded clothes. "Does anyone here have a statement?" he asked. His voice was deep, gravelly, and unimpressed by the luxury cars in the driveway. He looked at the crowd of 50 wealthy guests. The men in tailored suits and the women holding crystal wine glasses immediately looked down at their shoes. Not a single person who had just watched Brandon threaten a 16-year-old girl stepped forward. The silence of the elite was deafening. "I have a statement." The voice was raspy, old, but steady. Margaret, the housekeeper, pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She kept her chin high, refusing to look at Celeste. "I saw the whole thing," Margaret said clearly. "Celeste and her boy have been terrorizing Grace for months. Brandon threw a pair of gloves and attacked her first. He threw the first punch." Celeste's face flushed a violent crimson. "You lying old hag, you're fired. Get off my property." "Actually, sir, I have it right here." A younger voice broke through. "Lucas, The 17-year-old kid who helped with the landscaping stepped out from behind a large oak planter. He was wearing a dirt-stained t-shirt. He held up his smartphone, the screen glowing in the dusk. "I recorded the whole thing," Lucas said, his hands shaking slightly, but he held the phone out to the captain. Captain Sterling took the device. The tinny, compressed audio of Brandon calling me a freeloading hag played clearly. Then the video showed his wild, drunken punches and finally his heavy body collapsing into the mud. The captain watched the video twice. He hit pause. He handed the phone back to Lucas with a nod of thanks. Thorne turned to face Celeste. The casual demeanor was gone. His jaw was set. "Mrs. Vance," the captain said, his voice dropping an octave. "If anyone leaves this property in handcuffs tonight, it's going to be your son for assault and battery. I suggest you shut this party down immediately, or I'll start writing citations for disturbing the peace." The illusion of her untouchable power shattered right in front of her guests. Celeste's mouth hung open. She looked around, realizing she had completely lost control of the narrative. She grabbed Brandon by his sweaty shoulder, violently jerking him to his feet. She dragged him toward the heavy oak doors of the main house. Her stilettos stomped hard against the porch steps. Just before she disappeared inside, she spun around. Her eyes were filled with pure, venomous hatred. "You're dead, Grace," she spat, her voice shaking with rage. "You just wait. I am calling the Pentagon first thing Monday morning. I'm going to ruin your miserable life." I watched the door slam shut. I didn't smile, but I knew the truth. She had no idea she had just put her finger directly on the self-destruct button. Wednesday morning brought a freezing, bitter rain. The phone resting on my cheap laminate table vibrated heavily against the wood. I picked it up. It was Robert Miller, the director of federal procurement. He was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Celeste had spent the last 3 days frantically working her country club connections, finally forcing a direct phone call with him. She had screamed into the receiver. She demanded he fire a low-level, insubordinate clerk named Grace Kahn immediately. She threatened to pull her massive $40 million logistics bid if he didn't comply. I wedged the phone between my ear and my shoulder. I poured boiling water into a chipped ceramic mug. "What did you tell her, John?" "I told her the truth," Miller chuckled, his voice echoing slightly over the speaker. "I told her that Director Grace Kahn is the exact person who just froze her application. And since she just admitted to a personal vendetta against a senior federal reviewer on a recorded line, Sterling Freight is permanently disqualified due to a severe conflict of interest." He said the silence on her end of the line was absolute, suffocating. Celeste had just personally crushed her only ticket to wealth. The fallout hit like a freight train. Without the government contract, her private financial backers pulled their money overnight. Sterling Freight filed for bankruptcy before the end of the week. Lucas didn't just show that video to the captain, it circulated straight to the local MMA gym. The head coach there didn't tolerate guys who put their hands on women. He publicly stripped Brandon of his amateur belt and banned him from the mats for life. His fragile gym-built ego was permanently shattered. But the fatal blow came from Arthur. My father never stepped up to protect me out of love. He stepped up out of pure, arrogant pride. When he found out Celeste forged his signature on a federal application and used his name to threaten his own blood, his disgust was absolute. He filed for divorce the very next day. The prenuptial agreement he forced her to sign years ago was ironclad. They were given exactly 72 hours to vacate the estate. Early December arrived. A biting frost coated the dead grass. I stood on the rotting wooden porch of the shed, wearing my frayed gray cardigan. I wrapped both my calloused hands tightly around my hot mug. Down at the end of the property, a rented, beat-up budget truck crawled slowly down the gravel driveway. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the stones, spitting dirty exhaust into the crisp air. Celeste and Brandon sat in the cab. They didn't look out the windows. They kept their heads down, humiliated, hauling their cheap cardboard boxes out the exact same iron gates they had tried to lock me behind. I looked over at the old oak tree. The heavy suede bag was gone. The clanking metal chains were gone. The yard was perfectly still. The screen door creaked open behind me. Lena stepped out onto the porch. She didn't say a word. She just leaned close and rested her head gently against my shoulder. She wasn't shaking anymore. The freezing air carried the rich, earthy scent of damp, decaying leaves. Beneath the frost, Down by the edge of the property line, the old lilac bushes were already forming new, hard green buds. They were surviving the deep freeze, quietly waiting for the spring thaw. I took a slow, quiet sip of my tea. The war was over. This dirt finally belonged to the people who actually bled to keep it alive. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey and listening to my story. It means the world to know I am not alone in this fight. Please take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and goodbye for now. So, what did you think of this incredible story of resilience and calculated payback? Were you as shocked as I was by the protagonist's incredible strength and tactical mind? And what would you have done differently if you were in her shoes, facing such intense family betrayal and abuse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.